Hey, welcome to this week's video. In this week's video, we're going to talk about how you pay yourself depending on the type of business entity that you're set up in. You'd be surprised that there's different ways that you should and shouldn't pay yourself depending on the type of business entity that you have set up for your company. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through how exactly you would pay yourself depending on whether you're a sole proprietorship, an LLC, an S corporation, a partnership, or a corporation. So let's get to work. Okay, so let's start with a sole proprietorship, or what's called a disregarded LLC. When you set up an LLC, it automatically defaults to what's called a disregarded entity, which basically means you're a sole proprietor unless you tell the IRS you want to be taxed as something different. So how do you pay yourself as a sole proprietor or a disregarded LLC? Well, basically you can take money out as you need in the business. You then don't take any salary. You don't have to take any salary, unlike other types of entities that we will talk about. And you just take draws as you need it. So in your sole proprietorship, you take a draw, and how you are taxed is based on the business's net income. And this is net income before the draws. That'll be taxed in your personal tax return. Draws are not deducted from your net income like it would be if you were paying yourself as payroll and other types of entities. So now let's talk about an S corporation. Here's where things are going to change. In an S corporation, what the IRS does is they require you to pay yourself a reasonable salary. And I'll put a link to a video that I did on this, but without getting into too much detail, a reasonable salary is not something that's defined by the IRS, but instead is based on what you would have to pay somebody to basically do what you do for the corporation. So that's what you need to do first in your S corporation, is pay yourself a reasonable salary. Any money beyond that would be taken out as a draw. And what you want to do is you want to make sure that when you're looking at your S corporation, you take money out as payroll and a draw, but you also want to make sure that you have enough money in the S corporation to pay your operations. So let's talk about the tax implications of an S corporation. So an S corporation is a separate entity, and you file a separate tax return. And that tax return is based on your revenues and your expenses. Your expenses include the pay to yourself as a reasonable salary. Then you have your net income after all the expenses and your reasonable salary. That will then get taxed in your personal tax return. So what do you do then for the draws? The draws you can take out at any time that you want. Those are going to be funds that are taken out outside of payroll. And the beauty of an S corporation is that the main idea is to put your pay into two separate buckets. The first bucket is your W-2 or payroll bucket. That is going to include Social Security tax. The other bucket is draws. That does not include Social Security tax. And that's where the savings comes in from an S corporation. So you may ask, how are those draws taxed? Well, they're taxed already in most cases, because that money will then pass over, or the net income from that business will pass over to your personal return and be taxed regardless if you take that money out of the business. So that when you take a draw out of your S corporation, it is not taxed at that point in time. It may already have been taxed. Okay, so let's talk about a partnership. The partnership pay is going to be driven primarily by the operating agreement that you have with the partnership. But let's first talk about payroll. You're not required, like an S corporation, to take a reasonable salary, but partners can be paid, and usually that's going to be, again, based on the partnership agreement. Also, the partners, some of them materially participate, some of them don't materially participate. And what that really means is that when you do materially participate, normally that partner is going to be paid. But also on the draw side, draws are going to be dictated primarily from the operating agreement, if any draws. but that will be in the form of what's sometimes called a guaranteed payment. So you really have to take a look and work with your tax professional or accounting professional to see how the pay should work in a partnership to make sure you're in compliance with the agreement. Now, the tax implication for a partnership is that the income from the partnership gets transferred over to your personal tax return, and depending on if you materially participate or not, or depending on if you're a general partner, limited partner, again, you're going to have to check with your tax professional. That income may be subject to self-employment tax on your personal tax return as well. But just keep in mind that the business gets to deduct a salary that's paid to the partners, but anything that is left over as income will transfer over to your personal tax return based on your ownership and based on what the operating agreement is. So let's talk about a corporation, and here is where things kind of change a bit, because a draw is really not a draw, it's really considered a dividend. And here is where things change from a standpoint of what's considered double taxation. So let's start first by the payroll. In payroll, you're not required to pay yourself a reasonable salary, but in a lot of times in corporations, owners will pay them a large amount of salary so as to avoid the double tax when you do a dividend. But let's just say you're paying yourself a reasonable salary. You want to make sure that you're paying yourself an amount that is not too much, because if you ever got challenged, the IRS would then reclassify or possibly reclassify some of that pay to a dividend. Why is that important? Well, in a corporation, the tax implication is that you're able to deduct the salary, and then the net income then is taxed at the entity level. In other words, it doesn't transfer over to your personal tax return, but it's taxed separate right now in the corporation's tax return. So on a dividend side then would be then taxed on your personal side. So if you think about it, if you have income in your corporation that you paid tax on that income, then when you pay yourself a dividend, dividends are not deductible. So in other words, you're paying tax on that income inside of the corporation. Now you paid yourself a dividend, you're paying yourself tax on that income again in your personal tax return. So the thing in a corporation is kind of tricky, and you want to work with your tax professional or accounting professional to make sure that you get the pay right. But in a corporation, you start to accumulate earnings, and if you accumulate too much earnings in the business, then if you ever got audited, the IRS may say, well, some of that income needs to be paid out in the form of a dividend, and again, you get hit with that double taxation. So you want to take that into consideration when you are paying yourself through a corporation. So in summary, it's a great idea to understand exactly how your business is set up so that you can figure out how you should pay yourself. And you want to make sure that you consider, especially if you're an S corporation, what a reasonable salary amount is that you should be paying yourself in that S corporation. That's very important. The other thing is, and I see this quite a bit, is that especially with an S corporation, the goal is to pay yourself as low as possible, because the idea is when you pay yourself through payroll, you're paying FICA taxes or Social Security taxes, and when you pay yourself a draw, you're not paying yourself Social Security tax on that draw. Instead, that income is just taxed at ordinary income and doesn't include self-employment or what's called FICA taxes. So then if you have your salary low in an S corporation, when you review your P&L, the numbers will be lying to you in your net income, because what you need to do is you need to take a look at that net income, and you got to say, well, I paid myself $50,000, but I really should have been paying myself $120,000. So if I have income of $80,000 after I paid myself a salary, then I'm not making enough money. And that's where you can get yourself into trouble with an S corporation. And when you're reviewing your P&L, keep that in mind, because that's incredibly important to make sure that profitability-wise is good. The other thing you want to make sure is that you're monitoring your cash flow statement in your business, because in some cases when you're taking money out as a draw, you won't see that you won't see that in your P&L, because draws are not deducted in your P&L statement. So again, your numbers are then lying to you. So you want to make sure that you're looking at your cash flow statement, because that'll show you that how much money you're making from your operations of the business, and it'll show you the net cash flow of your business, positive or negative, which is very important to monitor. So that's it for this week's video. If you got any value out of it, it'd be great if you hit that thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed, it'd be great to have you as a subscriber. Until next time, thanks for watching.